I'm not a big fan of the term pathological liar. I mean, I get it. I get it from my behavioral perspective, from my field. You know, I have people that come in saying, oh, I'm a pathological liar. And really what I see is there was a habit formed because there was a lot of lying at an earlier time in their life because of a fear response that turned into, I've learned how to utilize dishonesty. Unpacking Mormonism is a subsidiary of Daisy Girl Communications, LLC. All content herein is intended for educational purposes only and does not replace the advice or counsel of your personal care provider.
Welcome back to Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma. I'm the co-host, Mason Westbrook, here with my beautiful and lovely host,
Sarah Westbrook.
Sarah Westbrook.
Am I your wife or just your host?
Both, definitely both. This will probably be a temporary role. That one will not be. Your
host. I'm going to have fun with that. Like, there's a lot of implications in that. For today, our goal is to gain an understanding about why people lie or why we might struggle with some dishonesty. We want to understand this from a neurological perspective. So, you know, some of that neuro-informed piece of this, because when we are able to better understand why we are engaging in certain behaviors, especially why we engage in behaviors when it has demonstrated, when the outcome is harming us or harming others. So we would identify that in my field as maladaptive. So, you know, why would somebody continue to be dishonest when they can see that it's harming themselves or others? I kind of want to get into that and understand that. And then we can kind of, look at that from the, from the LDS church, from the Mormon church, as to why are they still lying? Why are they lying? Why are we having a difficult time being honest, especially in a day and age where discovering the factual truth is so easy? Really quickly before I do that, though, I also want to say that we've got an episode on the Word of Wisdom coming up, and we've got a good friend, somebody I respect quite a bit. Our friend Ian Lumgare is going to be coming on to guest speak with us, and we're going to be talking about addiction. And one of the things that I absolutely love about our conversations with Ian is that he has been somebody in our lives that is very good at constructive criticism, and that we have lots of things we disagree on, but that we are still very good friends. I would consider his family some of our closest friends ever, and very much that that person that I can say, hey, we don't see eye to eye on a lot of things, and yet we still have a very deep and meaningful relationship. And I would, Ian, if you're listening, I'm speaking for you. Feels like he feels the same way towards us. I would hope so.
Hopefully, soon enough, he'll get the chance to tell you, no, that's not how I feel at all. Right? I can't believe you would say something like that.
Right. Well, yes. And so, again, kind of also modeling for our listeners, hey, you can have a difference of opinion and still have deep and meaningful relationships. So we've also got those things coming down the pipeline. We're also going to, in 2023, dissect the reasons why Sarah feels that the Mormon church fits the diagnostic criteria for being a cult. And one of the things that you have to be really careful with that when we talk about something being a cult is, again, we're going to be talking about adaptive and maladaptive tendencies of organizations that might make them cult-like. But one of the interesting things that's come up a lot in social media, some of these trends that I'm seeing are the Mormon members saying, we're not a cult, the ex-Mormon saying, yes, you are. And then kind of the apologetics that go on between that is, well, then every religion is a cult, every organization is a cult. And so they kind of dismiss that. And so I really want to do kind of a series on some of these cult-like tendencies and how they are adaptive or maladaptive with regards to religious organizations, and how that overgeneralization is not true. So those are just some things to look forward to coming up in 2023.
I hate that kind of statement. Well, then everybody is.
Right.
It's just because it's shifting the blame.
Yeah, and you're uncomfortable.
And it's shifting your ability to improve or overcome whatever it is that you're struggling with. If everybody is that way, somehow that makes it okay for you, when in reality, if you looked at yourself honestly, you'd probably be like, no, I'm not okay with that. Let me see what I can do about that.
Well, and really what you're talking about, Mason, is it's a form of thought stopping. So we're going to be really getting into thought stopping, because when we thought stop, we might have a change of or a shift in what we're thinking about, but it causes a trauma response in the brain, which we'll get into, again in this coming year. But it stops us from getting curious and having the power to change that dynamic.
Yes.
So today, let's get into this. Why do people lie? And I'm not going to answer the question right away. So, we're 10 minutes in.
Stay tuned.
It's coming up. Right. Okay. So first I want to do a review of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I know in past episodes we've talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I know that we've done, I think, the bottom 3 tiers in a previous episode where we kind of went into it a little bit further.
It's been on our list of resources and references at least twice in the shows that we've done, but we haven't really ever gotten deep into it.
Well, and it's not really something that would take up an entire episode. I mean, it could, but for our purposes, I don't think we necessarily need to, but I kind of want to talk about it in a little bit more depth today. So the first question is, why is it important to have an understanding of what Maslow's hierarchy of needs is? And I would say that the answer to that question is that as we become more aware of the shift from our creative, problem-solving, logical reasoning brain into that survival mechanism or that amygdala, so that when we get that amygdala response, one of the things that helps us gauge the level of intensity that we might be responding or how quickly we're triggering from a logical place to a protective fight, flight, freeze, fawn space is to understand more about our neurobiology and our physiology. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you get onto any Google site and you Google Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so Maslow is MASLOW '(S), and then hierarchy HIERARCHY, then the word of needs, you're going to pull up hundreds of images of something that looks like a pyramid. And I want to just kind of break that down, because when you get on there, there's tons of examples. Some of them I'm like, maybe that one's not quite as specific as I view it. I've got 2 of them in my office, 2 different pyramids of Maslow hanging up in my office that are kind of the ones that we use the most in behavioral health. But I want you, if you go on Google and look for one of these pyramids, I want you to be able to understand what this pyramid means to you. So it's somewhat structured after I'm going to say the old food pyramid, where at the base of it, you've got, your grains and your fiber and your bread stuff. And then your grains, you move up. You've got, how much meat you should be eating, how much dairy you should be eating, how many fruits and vegetables, so on and so forth, in order to have a healthy diet. The Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid is structured very similarly to the old food pyramid. But really what this is talking about is at the top of the pyramid, you have achieving your full potential. But really what that means is being honorable to your own moral values and your own personal standards. Now, when I say this, I'm not talking about the church's standards for you or an outside organization's standards for you. I'm talking about the things that as you have grown and developed, the morals and standards that you hold dear to yourself, that you feel are an intrinsical part of yourself. And so one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today is that Sarah Westbrook, her full potential, her full authentic self, I deeply value honesty. And yet I have a history in my early 20s especially of rarely telling the truth. And even today as a 41, almost 42-year-old woman, I occasionally lie. Well, when I start lying, I want to understand what's going on for me that's interfering with my ability to hold true to those moral and standard, those my own personal moral and standards and morals and standards. Oh my goodness, my words. Mason, throw something at me.
I'm not sure that would help.
Here's this little squeezy popcorn thing.
You want me to hold on to that so the next time I can just...
You just huck it at me.
I think then you'll just have an excuse. You'll be like, oh yeah, my words aren't coming together because Mason threw something at me.
Well, yeah, I want to blame you.
The mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank. And like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
Alrighty, so another one of Sarah's morals and standards is being accountable and owning where I've made mistakes. Well, when I don't behave in a way that is in line with my own morals and standards, most likely there's an issue going on for me at one of the lower tiers of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
And I think that society in general, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that society in general wants us rather... Where's that thing so I can throw it at you?
Go ahead.
Society in general, rather than wanting us to delve down and understand why we're doing what we're doing, they want us to jump right into whatever technique they decide is best for fixing the problem. In this case, oftentimes shame. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, I can't believe I did that. I'm such a stupid idiot. I can't believe I did that, which doesn't help us. And so what we want to do is be able to teach our brains to move past the immediate shame or even guilt response. Because the guilt response can be helpful, but to be able to move down into the why am I doing this? What's going on in my life, my brain, my mind, whatever today, what's going on that is allowing me or making me do these things.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to agree and disagree with you.
You can't do that. I'm sorry.
Yes, I can.
That was a full statement. Either you agree or you don't.
No, there was a lot of stuff packed into that statement. So let me put it this way. So let's see. Yes, I agree with you that one of the expectations that we have in society, which is a normal human expectation, this is also part of our neurobiology, is when something isn't right, we jump directly to problem solving. And usually we look at behaviors or things that you're doing that you need to change in order to solve the problem right away. I see this a lot in my marriage, in my couples counseling sessions. In my marriage. I see it in my marriage too. Good God.
Like,
okay.
I could see your face. I knew that there was more coming. But as soon as you paused there, I just started to laugh because I was like, yeah, okay. Let's talk about this today.
We should have stopped at Starbucks on the way in, but I was not willing to spend like $8.
Where's the tea that you brought?
It needs to be heated up. I don't know. I handed it to you. Where did you put it? Come on, Mason. This is your fault. You didn't bring my chai tea latte in. Goodness gracious. Y'all, it's okay. Anyway, moving right along. So I see this phenomenon a lot in the couples that I work with and also in my own marriage. Mason and I, we've absolutely been guilty of this, although that's not where I was going. And that is when something's going on that we don't like or that makes one partner uncomfortable, we jump straight to what you need to do to fix the problem, and we don't empathize or understand first. So Mason, where I agree with you is yes, we have a tendency to get to problem solving way too fast. We need to slow that down so that we can understand better what is going on for us that is leading to the behaviors that are not helping us or that are not serving us well. Where I disagree with you was your statement regarding shame and guilt. I agree with you. Shame is paralyzing, and society tends to use shame, or we use shame on ourselves as a tool to try and gain quick behavioral change or quick problem solving. Well, what Brene Brown's research has demonstrated is that it doesn't do that. We might get a behavioral change, but the cost of that behavioral change is significant. We have unsettled feelings, anxiety, depression, harmed relationships. We see more, a lot more maladaptive symptoms going on. Whereas guilt is one of those red flags. It is mobile. You can move within guilt. If I do something outside that does not line up with my own morals and values, I'm going to feel guilty. That guilt is not bad. It's uncomfortable, but that's the flag of I did something bad rather than I am bad. And guilt is the, hey, time to take a look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, understand the emotional responses, get empathetic, get curious. And so shame stops curiosity. Guilt immobilizes. Guilt mobilizes curiosity if we allow it to.
So that's what I said. And if it's not what I said, it's what I meant to say, is that society wants us, the main point that I want to point out that I wanted to make is that society is not usually about encouraging us to investigate why. They're about changing the behavior. And usually that comes with a lot of shame. Well, we'll shame you into a behavior change. And obviously that's not healthy. That
right.
Brene Brown has demonstrated with veracity that does not work for us.
Right. And if you can't tell, we idolize her just a little bit. Keep going.
Well, and it's because her research has finally demonstrated something that a lot of people have probably understood for a long time, but she's finally been able to put the research into play to demonstrate the reality of it. Like lots of things, medicine, all kinds of things. We do research to demonstrate that something does actually work the way that we think it does. Where guilt falls in is exactly what you said. Guilt can be helpful because it helps to mobilize us and make us think, oh, you know what? That's not how I wanted to do that. Okay. What's going on in my life that caused me to respond in a way that's not the way I want to respond? And that's where I wanted to go with that.
All right.
So I think that's what I said. It may not have been, but either way, it's been said now twice. I think we got it.
Right. The way that I heard it the first time you said it, that's not what I picked up. So I appreciate your clarity, your clarifying there of what your intent was. That's very important. Okay. So what is going on for us when we are not living to our full potential, where we have that? So let's talk about what are some signs that I'm not living to my full potential? And those would be I am living or making choices outside of the morals and values I personally hold dear to myself. And I've kind of belabored that point just a little bit, but I want to say, things like in our marriage, Mason, you value monogamy, correct?
Yes.
And the church teaches that monogamy is, they sort of teach that monogamy is the appropriate thing, and anything outside of that is sin. That would be a place where the organization's standards and values line up with your own. Where it would differ, like for me personally, I do not believe in nor have any respect or value for the idea of polygamy in the sense of the Mormon Church's teachings of how that's going to work in the afterlife. For me, that is way outside any of my moral values or standards.
Right.
Therefore, monogamy to me, or even open relationships or swinging, or all these different types of relationships, what those mean for me, I can align my values with open relationships, but not with the way the church interprets polygamy. So, wow, just opened a can of worms for all of our listeners that are like, whoa, Mason values monogamy and Sarah values open relationships. Let me clarify. Our relationship is at its healthiest when we are monogamous because that is what works best for us. However, in my field and what I see swinging relationships that appear very healthy. I see open relationships that appear very healthy. I have clients who practice polygamy, but not in the same way. Polygamy, bigamy, open relationship. You slap your label on it. I've seen it in my clinic. And what I see in my clinic and how the functions of that work are very different than what the church teaches. So my values align with healthy, consensual, respectful relationships with very structured boundaries. That would be where Sarah's values line up with, versus the churches where we've got, like Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff and some of these other guys that are like collecting women, hundreds and hundreds of women to one man. I do not align with. Okay, so when we are living outside of our morals and values, when we are working and problem solving without logical reasoning skills, empathy, understanding, and creativity, where spontaneity is uncomfortable or even threatening, those are going to be some of these flags that your bottom tiers within the Maslow's hierarchy of needs might be off kilter. So let's start with the very bottom rung. Mason, did you have anything you wanted to add before I bust through this? All right.
Drive on.
So we've got 5 levels of this pyramid. So at the base of this pyramid, we're talking about your physiological needs. So this is where I would talk again in my couples counseling sessions. If you guys are struggling communicating and you're hungry, you need to pause what you're saying to each other, pause the argument, go get some food, calm down your physiology, and re-engage when you're in a better space. So this is going to talk about food, water. It's not a good idea to have major discussions with your spouse that are argumentative when you've got the flu or COVID, because your brain is not all the way on.
During a snowstorm.
Right? Did we do that recently?
No.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we want you to be warm. We want you to be getting good sleep, those types of things. Our next rung up is our emotional and intellectual security. I'm also going to say security of resources. So kind of where you've got that, I'll say at the top part of the bottom rung and the bottom part of the next rung up. If your job is being threatened, that is going to fall into your security, or your second rung up is your safety. And this safety is talking about your physical and emotional safety. So if you're in a position or in a relationship where you are not safe to express your emotions without being punished, yelled at, hit. So domestic violence would be, there's a problem here in this red rung. You're not going to be able to function fully in your frontal cortex, where you are falling in line with your morals and your principles. So I actually had several years ago a client where whenever they would start to get upset about anything, one of the partners would call the police. And the other partner was like, I can't even say I'm feeling frustrated right now without their partner calling the police. That was stopping their ability to fix the issues in the relationship, because there was always a fear that the police were going to get involved and that, domestic dispute or whatnot. And so once we got the partner that was calling the police all the time to calm that down and identify, I will call the police when, my safety is truly being threatened. I've been hit. I'm being held against my will. When harm is imminent, then I'm going to call for help, rather than my husband or wife came home a little bit grumpy, so now I'm going to call the police because they're in a bad mood. That's kind of that security of resources, security of your emotional self, security of your physical self. The next rung up, or the third rung from the bottom, also our middle one, is love and belonging. And this is where we really get into the work of Brene Brown. If you feel isolated from your community, you are not going to be living at your full potential. You're going to be finding that you're getting tripped into your amygdala brain space a little faster than what you would consider normal for you. This is one of the reasons why when people first start to leave the church, you see a lot of what people would say overreactions. Now, I don't believe in an overreaction. I think that if somebody's having a more intense response or reaction to something when the stimuli seems pretty small, so like when I would watch Brig when he was a toddler throw a 6-hour fit when I told him he had to finish eating his carrots before he could have ice cream, I wouldn't say that Brig was overreacting. Rather, something's going on that is leading to a very intense and maybe what we would say unreasonable reaction to seemingly small stimuli. For Brig, it was that he was hallucinating and he was dealing with voices in his head, but did not yet have the ability to verbalize that to us. So that's not an overreaction. That is a response based on what's going on neurologically. And so when we don't feel like we are a part of a community, or when we lose our community, it makes sense that our amygdala is a little bit more protective. We also see this if you've been traumatized, where that amygdala tends to flip pretty quickly. And one of the challenges that we have when your amygdala flips too quickly, or it seems really intense, or anytime you feel like somebody's quote unquote overreacting, that's a sign that there's an underlying emotional belonging connection need that is not being met. And I just completely lost my train of thought because you keep playing with your headphones. You okay over there, Mason?
Yeah.
So anyway, when we feel outside or ostracized from community, or we don't feel like we belong, or we don't have healthy relationships with our family and our friends, we are going to trip into our amygdala much faster and usually with higher levels of intensity. Oh, that's what it was. If we've been traumatized, that's where my thought came back.
Yay.
If we've been traumatized and we're getting that flip into that amygdala space very, very quickly, it usually means that we have not yet had the opportunity to heal. And one of the phenomenons that happens with that is that if I'm triggering very, very quickly and my partner does not know how to hold space for that trigger, I begin to learn that my friendships or my values, I get separated. If you've ever seen this, we see this in addictions too, where you're stealing my money, you're not showing up the way I want you to. And instead of extending an extra hand of love and gentleness, we boundary up and we tend to put space between us and the person that's struggling. And what that does is it causes attachment issues, which will impair both parties' ability to respond from that frontal cortex in a way that is true to their own morals and values. Our fourth one up is respect, status, and recognition. Now, when we say status, I'm not talking about I'm, holier than thou, or I have the most money. However, that can cause issues, but I'm talking about clearly defined roles in your life and self-esteem. If you are struggling with feeling really bad about yourself all the time, like you're worthless all the time, then it makes sense that you're going to have a really difficult time living to your full potential. Mason, do you have any questions now that I've gone through the bottom four rungs? And the fifth step or the top tier is self-actualization. So basically the way I interpret Maslow is if tier 1 through 4 are in place, then you can function in tier 5, which is where you want to be most of the time.
Yeah, I don't think I have any questions. One of the things that kind of stood out to me, I think that you said a couple of times, is that when you're not in a good place on whatever level this is, whether it's physiological, safety, love and belonging, or esteem, if you're not in a good place, you're more likely to trigger or allow your amygdala to become involved in whatever it is that you're trying to do.
I wouldn't say allow your amygdala. I would say understand that your amygdala is going to.
Okay.
So for example, a really common thing that we see, the majority of marital affairs occur because there's a breakdown somewhere in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And in my clinic and in my personal life, it was the number 3, the love and belonging. You know, Mason, one of the things you and I have talked about was you didn't learn how to feel or emote when you were growing up. And so, you know, you kind of lived in this framework of, as long as I'm living righteously and checking off these boxes and stuff, then everything's going to be okay. And in our marriage, I can say things like our friendship was 100%. Like, we were golden on friendship. We did great on division of labor. You were respectful to me. I was respectful to you. We weren't arguing. We were pretty much in line on the financial issues. And so anybody from the outside looking in would be like, well, why on earth did Sarah cheat? And what was going on for me when I look at this is my emotional safety, because I was still struggling with my relationship with my father. And anytime my parents were coming out, which we were in El Paso, they were coming out to visit us every 6 weeks, I was being re-traumatized. Then you have the situation that you can read about in my book. And because Mason did not know how to truly emote and connect with the trauma I was in, that left me vulnerable for seeking that connection outside of our relationship. And I ended up doing something that was absolutely outside of what I would consider my own morals and standards. Right. Once we were able to work through and you were able to begin to empathize and connect with me on that deep emotional level, when I also then cut the triggering person out of my life because of the abuse and whatnot that I had received at the hands of him, then I was able to feel in, you know, tier number 2, emotionally safe, intellectually safe. And you, Mason, had learned how to connect with me emotionally and empathetically, and we learned how to talk through things in a way that I was being fulfilled. Now our relationship is a lot more secure and safe from that type of incident. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that this, you know, it's built as a pyramid, but it fluctuates throughout your life. You're going to have times where some of it is very secure and some of it's not very secure. So it's something that we can, again, when you're aware of how your body is working, you're much more able to plan for and adjust and work on things that are missing, because you're aware of what needs to be there, what matters most to you in your life, and what matters most to whoever you're trying to have the relationship with as well. So, yeah,
absolutely. One more example that I'd like to, you know, bring in, which would take us into, let's look at number 1 and number 2. One of the phenomenons we see across the world is that in very impoverished communities, we also see a higher incidence of violent crime, stealing, child abuse. We see a lot more of these deficits. We see difficulty with learning and educational or academic attainment. And one of the reasons why is, if we look at this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're constantly worried about when your next meal is coming or where it's coming from, or you're constantly afraid that you're going to get kicked out of your home, you're not going to be in the brain space where your brain is able to learn new information and retain that information.
Sure. Yeah.
You're not in a position where, when things, you know, your stress level is already, you know, a 10 out of 10. And so when something which would be seemingly small or easy for somebody else who's in a different socioeconomic class to solve, it's normal for you to become more intense in your anger, more frustrated, feel more hopeless. This is one of the reasons why we talk about in, you know, the behavioral health field that we need to make sure that people have food and safety and security, and they've got a roof over their head. We've got to make sure those physiological and then physical needs are met first before we can really expect somebody to retain, you know, academics. You know, when we look at our school systems, the poorer districts usually have lower test scores. It's not because poor kids are stupid. It's because they don't have the same resources that those individuals have from higher socioeconomic classes. So learning about calculus just isn't important when you're starving.
Right.
You know, your focus, if you are hungry, your focus is finding food.
Right. Well, and not that it's not important. Of course, some people are able to, we have examples of people who are able to push through that, but lots of people are not, because if the base isn't in place, it's really difficult to work on other layers. Not that you can't, but it's really difficult to work on other layers.
Absolutely. So moving forward, one of the things that I want to, again, reiterate is, in order to understand where you are at in this pyramid and how you're doing, you need to be able to identify what are the morals and values and things that I strive to be. Who is it? Who is the person I am trying to be? And then look at those lower tiers and say, what are some of the physiological, physical, and emotional needs in my life where there could be a deficit, and how can I address this deficit in a manner that does not cause harm to myself or others in order to become better, in order to reach my goal of who my true authentic self is. We do a lot about there's a lot of, it's kind of trendy right now to talk about living as your true authentic self, where it's really difficult to do that if you don't know what your morals and values are. Your internal morals and values are separate from those of the systems around you. So again, this would go back to that podcast we did on internal versus external sources. The external source, so the government, society, my teachers, my parents, the church, whatever it is, telling me who I should be and what's morally correct for me and what's right for me. I need to be able to break away from that and say, okay, I'm going to keep this one from my church, these 3 from my parents, these 2 from my schooling, but these other ones that don't work for me, I'm going to go ahead and shed that, and then I'm going to focus on living to that. Those morals and standards and goals that I have for me, what's getting in the way of me being able to do this?
Right. And my first thought was, you don't have to shed everything that came from your history or from your church or anything like that. It's more about an amalgamation as you're looking at what is that organization trying to teach me, and does that fall in line with the kind of person that I want to be? If it falls in line with the kind of person that you want to be, then you internalize it and you make it your own value. It's no longer that church, that organization, that family that is saying this is how I have to be. It's me deciding that's how I want to be.
Right.
And then you're, of course, going to end up in, there's no perfect organization out there. So you're going to end up with times where what they're telling you is not in line with who you want to be. And it may be a permanent thing. That's never going to be the kind of person I want to be. It might be a temporary thing. You know what? That is kind of who I want to be. I have no energy for that right now. I cannot focus on that. And so let me pull back to the values that are more important to me and keep that focus so that my energy is on the things that are of the most value to me right now.
Well, and something that I've seen a lot in clinic over the years are, I'm going to say gay or lesbian couples that will come to me either for individual counseling or couples counseling. And when we get into these types of topics, one of the things that we talk about is from their evangelical upbringing, Christian upbringing, Mormon upbringing, whatever that religious community is, one of the things that these gay and lesbian couples hold dear are, commitment in a relationship, commitment to the family, being honest with each other, treating each other with respect, finding, values and things and that they both honor. But where they're shedding is that marriage has to be between a male and a female. For them to reach their true authentic self, they are not going to find that type of look at tier number 3, love and belonging. That individual does not feel that sexual, intimate connection that we all, or that most of us, we don't all crave it, but that everybody. Most of us crave having some type of strong, intimate relationship. But for them, they could not find that in the heterosexual standard of the organization or the family that they came from. So once they shed the the standard of love is, love is man, woman only, and anything else is a sin. When they shed that and they are able to embrace love is love, and I want to be loved and valued by somebody who honors me, respects me, I can have intellectual conversations with, so on and so forth, suddenly they find happiness and peace. We hear words like you vibrate at the right frequency, or you're resonating with people. I mean, we can use all kinds of different language to describe this self-actualization or living to one's full potential. And really it comes down to, am I living in line with the things that I hold near and dear that are important to me? My internal self is informing who I am.
Right.
Am I living to that? If the answer is yes, great. If the answer is no, what's getting in the way and what can you do? Now, I will say that, again, most humans, when they are living in a way that is causing purposeful, intentional harm to others, they are not in number 5. And I've had several clients actually over the years say, well, what if my, moral and standard is to kill people? Well, we have this lovely mechanism in our brain that if we're not sociopathic or lacking empathy, causing harm to people usually is one of those morals and standards that is, from my perspective, ingrained in our DNA in order to keep our species alive. And so generally what we see across the research is that if you are intentionally causing harm to others, you feel pretty icky on the inside. And the only people that I know of that don't are people who fall in the sociopathic spectrum.
Right. Well, and this is an evolving process too.
Absolutely.
Obviously, your authentic, quote unquote, authentic self as a 14-year-old is not going to be the same authentic self as a 46-year-old. We change as people, we grow, we have different priorities, we
Right.
We move
our morals
differently.
and values can change.
Yeah, mostly this isn't about us defining what morals or values should, quote unquote, be. This is about us defining how we can work through this process to become authentic to ourselves. And we're barely touching on that. There's so many resources out there about how to do that will ring true for, Brene Brown might be the person that you study to do that, or it might be somebody else. But the point is not what the values are, but learning how to be that person for yourself and evolve as that changes, as you grow.
And finding community that accepts you for who you are, where you are, without judgment and whatnot.
Sure, absolutely. There's something that Brene Brown talks about that, she talks about the difference between...
You're on a Brene Brown
always
kick today.
Well, I think that if you're talking about basic needs of a person, you're going to get into the realm of how do I be authentic? How do I avoid shame? What is guilt going to do for me? And for me, no one describes that better than Brene Brown does.
Right.
And that's for me. I'm sure there's other people who talk about it, who describe it in a way that works better for someone else, and that's fine. But she talks about the difference between belonging and fitting in. Mm-hmm. And I think too often, because the world is around fitting in, and what fitting in, to be just brief, what she says fitting in is changing yourself in order to be a part of an organization, whereas belonging is becoming your authentic self and then finding the group that works with you, that allows you to be that person.
Right.
And they're very different things. Sometimes they don't look a lot different, but they're very different things. And even with the church, there's lots of people who know the things that we talk about with Mormonism or other religions, and they still feel like they belong. And that's great.
That's great.
Yeah, that's an organization that works within their values and who they want to be. And then there's lots of people who don't do that. They learn those things and like, that's not who I am. I can't be like that, so I don't belong there anymore. If I continue to go, I will just be seeking to fit in, and that's not authentic to who I am.
Yeah, well, and That reminds me of I did a call in. I've called into the Mormonism Live podcast a couple of times, and I want to say it was episode 87, and Bill Reel said something to me about fitting in or belonging, and I'm extrapolating here, so this is not an exact quote, but something along the lines of, with the church, most people are forever trying to fit in because the church has its set of morals and values and standards. And the way that you belong in that church is to align yourself with the church's morals and standards. Whereas belonging is having an organization that accepts you for where you are without changing their own morals and standards. I can be accepting and loving to my gay brothers and sisters without becoming gay myself. I am a heterosexual woman. I can have friends and accept and love and make sure that my LGBTQIA brothers and sisters feel comfortable and safe and loved in my home without me saying, okay, well, I guess I have to be gay too. And vice versa. My LGBTQIA brothers and sisters will accept me with my sexual orientation being heterosexual because that is that belonging community. Whereas with a lot of organizations, the only way you can belong is if you shift so that you fit in. So, all right. So some deep thoughts. We're kind of all over the place today. I like it. Every now and then it's a great way to be. All righty. So what does this mean then how do we take this information to why do people lie? And I think it's important to, again, if we get back into that amygdala, our fight, flight, freeze, fawn response is set up to keep us alive. It's set up to protect us. And one of the things that's really interesting about dishonesty is almost always people are lying from a place of fear. They lie because they feel the need to protect themselves or somebody else. Occasionally when people say, oh no, they're just lying so that they can gain attention, my question is, what are they afraid of? If I have to gain attention and so I'm lying to do that, what is my fear? What is the root cause of the dishonesty? And if I'm trying to get attention, is it that I don't fit in? Is it that my emotional needs are not being met? Is something going on for me? Am I lying to get attention so that people will pay me money or give me something that I need so that I can get food or clothing? Or maybe I'm stealing money and lying about it because I need to have designer clothes in order to feel like I belong in my social group. It doesn't really matter. For me anyway, I have yet to see a lying behavior that does not have its root base in the emotion of fear. The other thing is that people can lie so often that when we start to remove the fear, it's because lying has become a habit. I'm not a big fan of the term pathological liar. I mean, I get it. I get it from my behavioral perspective, from my field. I have people that come in saying, oh, I'm a pathological liar. And really what I see is there was a habit formed because there was a lot of lying at an earlier time in their life because of a fear response that turned into, I've learned how to utilize dishonesty as a survival mechanism, as a coping skill, and that really when we address the underlying fear, the low self-esteem, the triggers, the abuse patterns, the whatever it is that's creating that very initial, when I started lying, I was afraid of, when we can address that fear and really unpack that, then we see the lying habit actually start to disappear and vanish.
Makes
because
sense, yeah.
people lose the fear, therefore there's no reason to lie. So once again, when I come back to this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if I'm looking at tier 1 through 4, what need is not being met, if I can identify that, I'm probably also going to figure out where I'm trying to protect myself and understand better why I'm struggling with being honest in certain situations. I know for me as a kid, I lied because I didn't want to get swatted with a wooden spoon. I lied because if I wasn't the best at everything, I didn't get love and attention from my father. And so for me growing up, I developed a habit of lying and exaggerating and stretching the truth in order to feel loved and accepted and safe in my family of origin. One of the things that was a very interesting dynamic for me was that when I told the truth, it was never enough and I got punished anyway. So making my stories fantastical and entertaining meant that my parents would engage with me. And when my stories were the normal, everyday little kid things, I got ignored. So I was lying for attention because I needed tier number 3, love and belonging. I needed to have my parents engage with me. And so what for my family of origin, what happened was there was either gross neglect or serious abuse, and finding the balance in between where I wasn't being neglected, but I also wasn't getting punished was this constant dance for me. And it took until the marital affair, Mason, in 2004, when I went and started to see Jim, who was my very first counselor that of my own free will and choice I got to go see more than once, where I was able to address, why do I lie all the time? What is going on for Sarah that makes the truth not safe?
Yeah. Well, and that's where we have to get to. If we want to overcome whatever it is that's going on in our lives, in this case, we're talking about lying, we have to be able to discover what is the root. And you said that overall, mostly it has to do with fear, but you also mentioned a couple others. There's root causes for what's going on in our lives, and we have to be able to figure it out. And sometimes that requires help. Certainly, some of the issues that you and I have both struggled with, it required help. We were not able to figure it out on our own. We needed someone that could kind of direct and poke and prod sometimes those places that we're not ready or willing or able to poke and prod on ourselves.
Right. Well, and
but
one of the things
that's the point, is to find that base piece. What is it that is leading me in this direction?
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the things for me was that I figured out how to dance that line in my family of origin until I turned 16 and had my first sexual experience. But from very young, like before I can even really remember, I mean, I remember lying to my parents as early as 3, 4, 5 years old about pretty much everything. I mean, I was too little to understand that most of my, peers' parents didn't believe a dang thing that I ever said. But in my family of origin, I figured out that dance within that dynamic, which broke at 16. But then when I entered your family, Mason, I figured that the same dance that I, danced in my family of origin would work for your family. And what I ended up getting was brothers and sisters-in-laws and your parents who didn't like me because I was constantly exaggerating, one-upping, and making shit up to try and be loved and belong. And it backfired on me, and I couldn't understand why. At the time I entered your family, I was 18, so I've got an underdeveloped frontal cortex. This was how I got love and acceptance for years and years. Why wasn't it working in a different environment?
Right.
I had no concept that I was sabotaging my own belonging in your family, nor did your family have the emotional skill set to say, Sarah's not being honest because of the abuse and the craziness she experienced as a young person. And it,
right.
With you would say, Sarah, when you exaggerate like that, I struggle to believe you and I just don't know what to think. And a lot of why I started to be able to be really honest with you was because we got to work through it. I didn't get punished
right
for exaggerating. I got a gentle redirection, and very quickly in our personal relationship between you and me, the exaggerating disappeared because it wasn't necessary to gain your love. But in your family, as I exaggerated, they pushed me away. I exaggerated more because it was the only skill I had, and they pushed me away. And I couldn't understand that. And here I am, 42, and some of the negative effect of those early years, 18, 19, 20-year-old Sarah, I'm still getting punished for today, in the sense of, I mean, your dad will say, well, we can never believe what Sarah says. And, you know, your brothers, oh, Sarah just blah, blah, blah. Like, I get brushed off my opinions, even when I'm able to now say, this is why I think the way that I do. And I don't exaggerate. In fact, with your family, I tend to minimize because they don't believe what I say no matter what. So I try and make it as simple just so they believe me. I've never regained that trust in them. And a lot of that is because, again, a lack of skill between the two parties. You know, we're talking about relationship dynamics here. I can do everything I want to do, but if they're not in a place where they want to understand why Sarah exaggerated and lied and one-upped and put them down at 18, 19, and 20, we'll never be able to heal the relationship at 40, 44, 45, 46. Yeah. And then me leaving the church just threw a whole new wrench in that. So now I'm an apostate who they never liked in the first place. It's just, you know, for me, it's like, all right, I'm done. I'm out at this point.
Right. Well, and you need to be able to bring it up. Like, they need to be able to say and talk about, well, actually, the reason that this is going on is because of such and such.
Right.
And you need to be in a place where you can hear that. And then they need to be in a place where they can hear where you are. And there's pieces of that missing. And certainly his space doesn't help either. You know, it's not like we're there every other afternoon.
Thank God.
Well, and in some ways, maybe that would make the difference. You know, if there was, and I'm not saying it would, but if there was more exposure, kind of like exposure therapy, then there would be more opportunity for that to grow. You don't think so, and that's because the experiences that you've had with my family have not been positive, and you may be right. But I'm just saying space is one of the things that can affect that as well.
But let me help you understand something that's really important. When we utilize exposure therapy, we control the environment that you are being exposed to ensure that you are not re-traumatized. So, for example, I had a client years ago who was terrified of being inside elevators with men because she had been sexually assaulted. I went, after we did therapy and understood things, that client and I was doing in-home stuff. So we were able, like, one of the wonderful things about therapy outside of a brick and mortar building is that you can get really in there. So at the time I was working as an in-home or on-site therapist. So I had the opportunity to do a lot with exposure therapy. And so with this client, I went onto the elevator with her and walked her through breathing exercises and calming herself, but I was there to ensure that none of the men on the elevator were going to just suddenly jump her. So when we do exposure therapy, we have to make sure that the environment that we're exposing ourselves to will not re-traumatize us.
Sure.
In order for me to have a healing of the relationship with your family, there has to be a third party there, because what's the skills that they may have learned to accept me differently and the skills that I've learned to behave differently, we've never done those together. It would require a controlled environment for that exposure to occur. Otherwise, we would end up like your brother and sister that live there, where there's a lot of exposure and it's a shit show every single time.
Right.
Because nobody has been there to create a controlled environment where the exposure and the efforts are able to be practiced and reciprocated safely. That's why I'm a huge, huge advocate for family therapy for adults, like not just mom, dad, little kids, but adult children with their parents. It can be very healing because the therapist helps manage the environment so that the changed behavior is modeled and practiced safely.
Sure, absolutely. I agree with everything that you just said. I'm not saying that space is the key factor.
Definitely
simply
not.
That it is a factor. And in this, for instance, say my brother was in a place where he was ready to understand. It might be improved if we were closer. but he would have to be in a place where he's ready to understand. And that's not the case. So space or no space doesn't matter at this point in time. But if that were to happen, then space might be helpful.
Yes.
So, and that's all I'm saying is that there's other factors there too. But don't forget, read the room. Like, be as close as you want to somebody. If they're not in a place or you're not in a place to be able to work through this, it's not going to happen.
Right. I can agree with that.
Yeah.
Alrighty, so let's talk about organizational dishonesty, or where organizations, religions, corporations, governmental, entities, whatever, when they're being dishonest, what is the root cause? And from my perspective, I would say the root cause is still fear. Based on our experiential expertise, so the organization that Mason, you and I have been in that we feel has been dishonest, and for the purposes of this podcast would be the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church.
Right.
And so, Mason, you prepared a couple of examples. Let's go through these examples one by one. And what I want to do is be able to point out potential fears. Now, I'm not saying that my statement of this is probably what they were afraid of is factual or true, but I would say in an attempt to understand why the Mormon Church might be having a difficult time being honest or owning and becoming accountable for their dishonesty is, again, because of fear.
Sure. And this is practice, right? As an example, if you're lying to me and I sit with myself and try and just think about, well, what are some of the reasons that she might be lying to me? It might be a helpful practice for me to just kind of recognize maybe I could be more empathetic. And then when I go to you and say, hey, look, this is what's going on. I feel like you're lying to me. Can we talk about this? I might be better prepared for whatever is going on.
Right.
And in this case, with the church or an organization, same sort of thing. If you can sit and think, well, why might they be doing this? It can help you to understand that organization a little better. In this case, you may not be able to go to the organization and say, this is what I think, what's going on?
Well, and I want to kind of reiterate what you said there. If I understand why my children are lying to me, if I can go, okay, what are they afraid of? What's going on here? I'm able to shift the environment so that I become a safe person that can hold and handle the truth without creating that fear response. So once again, I come back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, tier number 3 of that, and tier number 2, safety and belonging. If I'm able to say, hey, my kid is lying to me because they're afraid of getting into trouble, we really have some, life lessons here. If I can shift out of, okay, you're not going to be in trouble, let's just understand what's going on for you, and then how can we make sure this doesn't happen in the future? I'm increasing the chances that my kids are going to be honest with me. Where if I'm like, you lied, you're grounded for a month, and you don't get your iPad, well, what I'm doing is I'm creating an environment where that child's most likely going to lie to me again. Right. So what is my purpose? I mean, I'm not saying don't discipline dishonest behavior, but you have to make sure that that discipline is conducted in a way that the person who is lying feels emotionally safe, physically safe, loved, and like they belong.
Frontal cortex, right? They're not going to be able to put
and
together.
Amygdala.
They're not going to be able to put together the fact that, well, if I don't lie, then I'll be in a better place. Oftentimes they put together, well, I just need to lie a little better next time.
Yup. Absolutely.
So anyway, there's a list here. I didn't necessarily want to talk about all of these things, but if you want to go through them a little bit.
Let's just do an example or two. So go ahead and start with the example of dishonesty.
So there's a few things. If you look at just historically, there's the rock and the hat, where Joseph Smith was translating from the seer stone in the hat rather than from actually looking at the plates, or the Urim and Thummim, which was provided for him.
Right. So let's slow this down. So Mason, how old were you when you found out that Joseph Smith used a rock and a hat rather than what you had been told from primary and from the illustrations and the artwork of the church? How old were you?
Maybe 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
43.
So 43 years old. When did the church know that that's what he had done?
I don't actually know that for sure. I know that there's been talk about it, and there's been comments made, but I'm not sure.
Right. I think if I'm remembering correctly, we know that at least Joseph, is it Fielding Smith? Is it Joseph Fielding Smith that like ripped the pages out, or was that
Yes.
Joseph F. Smith? So Joseph Fielding Smith knew, and based on the documentation and the journal entries and the information that we have that looks objectively factual, Joseph Fielding Smith knew and continued the misrepresentation.
Right.
So the question is, why would prophets, seers, and revelators feel like it's okay to continue to misrepresent the truth? And I'm going to say misrepresent rather than bold-faced lie, because I don't have any evidence that says, did Joseph Smith use a rock and a hat to translate the Book of Mormon? And somebody saying, no, it didn't happen that way in my lifetime. I don't have any information. I'm sure somebody somewhere has something, because one
Right.
person may have, who knows who may have said it not knowing what the truth was. You were 43 before you knew that the peepstone was used.
My experience is that it is that they're holding back information.
Right, so lying by omission. So what are some of the reasons that somebody might do that?
Not having an explanation, feeling like you cannot explain
Right.
why that is the
Fear
case.
of not having the right answer.
And consequently, so in a church organization, I feel like the fear of not having the right answer leads to the fear of, well, somebody's going to walk away and it's going to be partially my fault.
Right.
And I think that that's kind of bred into the church, that if we don't have the right answers and someone leaves on account of that, somehow I'm responsible for that. And so there's a big fear there,
Okay.
I think.
Okay, I can say that. Yeah, that would make sense. And again, we're supposing and assuming here, so please recognize this as assuming. We
Right.
might be
It's all
making an
just
ass
practice.
out of you and me, but
Well,
but
it's just practice.
this is that, right? We're demonstrating that understanding. From my perspective, I would say that utilizing a rock and a hat to find treasure and the mythological belief and stuff probably wasn't as voodoo or weird then as it is today. We know that there was a magical worldview during Joseph Smith's day. We know that treasure hunting with peepstones and those types of things were very common in that day and age. So my guess is that in Joseph Smith's time, having the plate somewhere in a peepstone really wasn't that odd, because it was accepted by the people that Joseph Smith was engaged in with. We can, I think, safely assume that Oliver Cowdery and Emma Smith and Sidney Rigdon and Brigham Young knew that Joseph Smith had a stone and a hat with his face buried in the hat dictating the Book of Mormon. And it wasn't weird to them. It was normal for them. Somewhere
Right.
along the line, it became odd. And maybe the nuance of that's how it was done changed, and people started making art. I don't know if this was we purposefully covered this up, or if it was we outgrew the story and then we inserted different things and people just naturally started to assume. And so the discovery of, no, it was actually this way was a little bit like, whoa, wait a minute. Everybody's going to think that's crazy. My thought is that it was covered up. It was not brought out and taught to us because it was weird. There's already a lot of weird, mystical, magical things in the, origin story. How much more mystical can it get? So I think there was also probably a fear of people wouldn't believe in the church and the church would fall apart.
Yeah. I think that back then it probably just didn't matter why, like the details of how it had happened didn't matter, because if the Book of Mormon is true, then the Book of Mormon is true, and the exact details of how he translated it, no big deal.
Right, and it wasn't an issue that the church really had to address out loud. Again, that kind of lying by omission, like why bring it up? This is working.
Well, and that's
until the day of the internet came, and then
Right.
suddenly we've got all kinds of access to a very different narrative. And now in this day and age, if somebody came to me and said, hey, this rock in the hat told me that this book is true, I'm going to be like, yeah, F off. This is not, you're a wackadoo. Well, if you come to me like that, I'm going to be like, hey, let's go talk to somebody about getting some antipsychotics going. That's going to be my initial response. Because it just doesn't feel or seem real. We no longer live in a world with that type of mysticism being the norm.
Right.
Okay.
Well, and the main piece I want to get to is a little bit later, but let me just share a couple of other examples. Sticking with Joseph Smith, there's different records of the first vision. We're talking about polygamy. Now, me personally, I knew that Joseph Smith was a polygamist as a teenager. I knew that was the case. Now, some of the more icky details,
so I want to pause. I also knew that Joseph Smith was a polygamist growing up. Like, that was taught to me in seminary. What shocked me about that was the polyandry, the nature of how young some of the brides were.
Young girls, yeah.
Right. And the number, for me, it was more like maybe a handful or two handfuls, like 10, 12 at the most, rather than whatever it is, like 34, 44, whatever it is. Right.
It always seemed there were attempts to minimize the fact that he was a polygamist rather than just to accept the fact that this was the case.
Lying by minimizing.
Yeah. Or just trying to make it not a big deal instead of recognizing, you know what, for a lot of people, this is going to be a big deal. Let's just talk about it.
So again, where's the fear response? Or is there a different response? Like when we're covering it up, what's the concern here?
I think it's the same. I think it's that if you start talking about the fact that Joseph Smith married and probably had sex with 14, 15, 16-year-old girls or women that were married to other men.
Well, I'm going to pause you. One of the things that has been a consistent lie in the church that I've heard in my lifetime was that Joseph Smith married them, but he did not have sex with them. And evidence would absolutely discredit that based on multiple sources. If you're wondering, hit up Mormonism Live, Mormon Stories. We're not going into that here. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. Go hit up those other sites. So the idea, I remember it was only 18 months ago where your mom told me, like your mom who's in her 60s, told me, I said, I've got some concerns about his practices and marrying these girls that are really young. And her response was, he didn't have sex with any of them. He only ever had sex with Emma. And I looked at her and I said, unfortunately, Mom, that's just not accurate. And then in the words of, I think it was Maven who brought it up on a Mormonism Live episode, even if Joseph Smith had not had sex with these girls, how did it change their existence in their environment? And why are we ignoring the impact that these behaviors had on these individuals?
Right.
Why are we covering that up?
Right. Well, and if you want to learn more about polygamy and how that's an issue, we did an episode on that when you were talking about your history. Right. There's multiple episodes.
Hundreds of resources.
Lots of resources out there. In Sacred Loneliness is a terrific book that talks about that.
Yeah.
But
we need to put that on here.
The point being that the church has known from
the very beginning.
Day 2, maybe not day 1, but from day 2 that this was going on, and they haven't taught it in an honest way.
And let me clarify, when you say day 2, what we mean is when Joseph Smith started practicing polygamy, other people knew about it that were in positions
the leadership
of
knew
leadership.
Right.
Because somebody had to perform the marriage, y'all.
Right, because they were invited in.
Right.
Yeah,
it was a very secret group inside Mormonism. That secret group knew, and the members of that secret group were leaders of the church. Some of them weren't, but some of them absolutely
were. The next
were.
one's the Book of Abraham. Don't even want to go there right now, but just all the things that have gone on with that. Another big one for me.
Whoa. Hang on. We got to slow down, though. If we're looking at once historians identified that the papyri Joseph Smith used was most likely funerary text, when did the church come out? What would be the reason for being dishonest about that or changing the narrative? And again, I think we've got to look at that why. So Mason, one of the things that I feel like you're doing right now is because we're running short on time. You're like, I don't want to talk about this one, but here's another example of where they lied. I don't want to talk about this one. Here's another example of where they lied. Let's slow that down. What would be the purpose of changing the narrative or changing the story and not owning, hey, maybe somebody knew, maybe somebody didn't, maybe this is news to all of us. Why aren't we accountable for this? What's the purpose? Okay. And so I want to make sure that even if you and I don't dissect the why, the reader has the opportunity to. What is the church's purpose? If this was you and you got caught in a lie and you changed your story, but that change of story was another lie, What's going on for you?
Well, I think in this case, the reason that the lies are going on is because this calls into question not just Joseph Smith as a person, but Joseph Smith as a prophet.
Right.
His ability to translate based on the Book of Mormon is now called into question based on the Book of Abraham. He claimed they were essentially the same thing in the way that they came about. So if the Book of Abraham is a fraud, then it calls into question the veracity of the Book of Mormon. And therefore, as the church itself states, if you call into question the Book of Mormon, you call into question Joseph Smith. And if you call into question Joseph Smith, the whole thing unravels. Yeah.
So does it make sense, though, if I'm a person and I've gotten caught and I change my narrative because I'm afraid of the security of my home, the security of me continuing to survive in the environment that I am most comfortable and familiar with, I might be dishonest. I also want to say, maybe I'm going to lie because I don't want to harm my children. So maybe the leadership is saying, "Ooh, we want to keep this under wraps because this would devastate the membership." What would happen if the church fell apart? Where would all these people go?
Right.
Like, it would be damaging. It would be devastating. So the intent might be, we're not going to talk about this because we want to protect our members from the pain of knowing the truth.
Right.
But then, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you perceive it, with the age of the internet, people are learning the truth, and now they're hurt because they've been lied to, and it's calling into question.
Sure. And sometimes slow exposure is better than fast exposure.
Right.
But not always. And just, trying to understand that. So
Right. Well, and it's just like anything. I remember when I was a kid in family home evening, we talked about lying being like a spider web and you get all wrapped up in it. And I remember tying my siblings up in yarn as a family activity. And, when it was one string of yarn or two strings of yarn, you could bust out of the lies really easy just by being honest. But once you got like wrapped up in a whole skein of yarn, you were pretty entangled and enmeshed. I'm going to say the church is wrapped up in thousands of skeins of yarn and they're having a difficult time cutting free. And oftentimes when you're found in that position, being simply and basically just honest is the best way to come out of that. Well, there's a lot going on here.
So the church's leadership gains a lot of power, whether healthy or unhealthy. They gain a lot of power through trust. And so now that our ability to trust them is called into question, there's a lot of unraveling that goes on there.
Yeah.
There's two more. One, the last one is the one that I really want to get to, but the next one is the quote-unquote revelation on the LGBTQ population.
You're talking about the policy where 8-year-olds can't get baptized until they're adults and disavow their parents' lifestyle.
Right.
Okay.
And not so much the revelation itself, but the way that it was brought about. You know, when Nelson talks about it or other people talk about it, they talk about the
unanimity,
the revelation, the unanimity of the 12 apostles, and how this was from God. And then 3 years later, for whatever reason, hopefully because they saw the devastating impact it was having on a certain population, they rescinded that, but they rescinded it with far less flourish than they did when they brought it to us.
If we talk about the lie, though, I think that there's enough evidence. Again, go see Mormonism Live for your source material, that like Christofferson wasn't there and that it wasn't unanimous, and we can demonstrate
President Monson
that
was probably not in a place where he could even make that call.
They say that
there were other things going on. Yeah.
Right, President Monson was in a place where he was drinking hot cocoa and watching movies because the Alzheimer's, dementia, or whatever had taken him so far away, blah, 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 blah. So yeah, there's enough as you like come back and look at that. And we see that with, the story of like Holland's got the story of the brothers finding each other, whatever. We've got the airplane story from Nelson. We've got the shooting in Africa story of Nelson.
Lots of examples,
where people have been dishonest. What's going on? And I would say in this case, there seems to be we have to demonstrate that we're still getting revelation, that the lines of communication are open because people are beginning to question our status as prophets, seers, and revelators, as far as a prophet being somebody who communes directly with God.
Right.
And so we're seeing this pattern of dishonesty.
Right, exactly. And the last piece is, and you kind of asked me why this was a big deal. I'm going to try and explain it. But the last piece is the fact that, and we've mentioned this many times before, but when Dylan Oaks says that don't criticize your leaders, even if the criticism is true, just don't do it. And then the extra piece to that is that,
excuse me,
even if they get caught in this criticism, they don't apologize.
Right, even if it's true.
Even if it's true, they don't apologize. And I think the reason that matters so much to me is, you know, you see people in your clinic, marriage people that are struggling with things, and one of the big things is they just won't apologize for their behavior. They've got a beautiful relationship, but they just can't apologize, and so things fall apart. That happened really actually between you and your dad. Your dad was just unwilling to apologize for anything that he had ever done, and that was really the big piece that led to you guys.
Well, and for me, the reason I put my hand up, that's why Mason stopped. I want to clarify the reason that the apology from my dad was so important to me was because if he could take ownership for the very damaging things he had done to me as a youth and then to my children, that was the first step to make sure that he would be safe in the future.
Right.
And the issue that I was having is that he wasn't apologizing, he wasn't acknowledging the issues, and he was engaging in the harmful behavior more frequently with more intensity, so consistent that, and I think that that's, you know, for me, if we're not allowed to criticize, if we're not allowed to call people out, if you're not willing to take accountability for where you've messed up, chances are you're going to continue to repeat the maladaptive behavior. You're going to continue to harm. You're going to continue to lie.
Right.
You know, this is like saying, I caught my kid stealing or lying to me, and I'm like, well, I'm not allowed to criticize you, so you're going to just escape any accountability. And, you know, and it's my fault that you lied to me. It really messes things up, but it stops healing. It doesn't correct the behavior. Go ahead, Mace.
Right. It doesn't allow for any growth. And really my big concern, that what really hurts me in this situation is that apology is absolutely imperative for any relationship to grow and heal. We all make mistakes. We all do dumb stuff. If I didn't have the ability to apologize in my marriage, we wouldn't be married. Sure. And vice versa. If you didn't have the ability to apologize, we wouldn't be married, because there would be things that happened that we could not overcome.
Right. Apology, effective apology, is vital to healing emotional wounds.
Yeah.
Without it, you don't heal.
Right. I'm not talking about blow away apologies. I'm sorry I did that. I'm not talking about that kind of crap.
I didn't feel like you had.
Right.
I'm just reiterating.
Well, and you clarified it well. Like, we're talking about real apologies with real acknowledgement and real forgiveness and all of that stuff. Everything that goes into healing a situation that didn't happen the way we wanted it to. Well, in this case, you've got leadership in an organization, in this case the church, that is recognizing all these things happened. I find it impossible to believe that they're not recognizing how much they're hurting people, but they're not being forthcoming in acknowledging the reality of those things. And it feels dishonest. It feels disingenuous to what's going on. And yes, I can see that there would be a huge fallout from things like, for instance, the LGBTQ thing. If in 2018 they had come out and said, you know what, we were wrong. We thought we were getting inspiration and guidance from God. It has become obvious that was not the case. And we are here to apologize. As a leadership of your church, we screwed that one up. There would be some fallout because some people would not be able to handle the fact that the leadership recognized and verbally essentially shouted their vulnerabilities, their fallibility. People wouldn't be able to handle it, but so many other people would be like, thank you. Well, oh my gosh, thank you.
And one of the reasons they probably don't is that they can't. Because if they acknowledge that they effed it up, they're open to lawsuit. They're open to liability. And that is terrifying. You know,
Sure.
What happens if the prophet gets up and says, you know, actually, I claimed that this was revelation. It wasn't. I'm sorry. And then we're able to say, well, because of that revelation, now you're outside of the freedom of religion protection and you're open for suit. How many people could sue them? Now, I'm not saying that that's that's a reason to lie.
Right.
But I am saying it is a reason to lie. There is fear there. And as we can understand why they're doing it, we can make our decisions of what we want to do and how we want to proceed in that relationship. For me, I can very easily track, because of what I do, how that revelation impacted hundreds of thousands of people in minority and already othered groups.
Right.
I can't be a part of an organization that's going to stomp on them and act as if their lives are meaningless. I can't do it. I have to leave. But that's Sarah's individual morals and values. I understand that for me, I can only be a part of organizations that own when they screw up and that work to do no harm to everybody. And for me, Sarah Westbrook, I don't feel like the Mormon church fits that. I just don't. And it's really because of the lack of accountability. Does the Mormon church do good things? Yes, of course they do. But they do enough harm that it doesn't fit into Sarah's self-actualization. It's not in Sarah's tier number 5 on Maslow. And because they're not willing to change, because I haven't seen anything that demonstrates that they're ready to take accountability for covering up the truth, for harming these people, for doing these things, it's not an organization I can be a part of and feel like I, tier number 3, belong, and feel like my brain is going to be safe so that I can stay in tier number 5. I have to leave. That's Sarah's truth. That doesn't mean it needs to be that way for others.
Right. Well, and I'm finding that as I go through this journey, this is one of the big pieces for me, because I believe in constructive criticism. I believe that we need to be able to, in any organization, whether it be in a relationship, you know, a husband-wife, a family, a business organization, a church,
right,
whatever, the earth family, if we cannot provide constructive criticism.
Respectful constructive criticism.
Sure. I think that respectful is an important piece of that, but I don't think it's the most important piece. Unfortunately, sometimes we're not respectful in the way that we offer criticism, but it's the criticism that is absolutely imperative. I think that without constructive criticism, organizations will fail eventually. And I think that in tandem with that, people have to be able to apologize for the mistakes that they make. They have to be able to acknowledge the things that they have done that are not in line with what they're trying to accomplish, and move forward that way. So
Absolutely.
For me, that has become a very big point, and I'm not certain I can remain in an organization that does not allow for criticism. To be fair and honest, I'm trying, but I'm not certain that I can, because those are big things for me.
Because accountability equals change. Accountability usually leads to improvement. Accountability heals.
Yes. And that has been my experience in my life. And as I look back over the church's history, even the things that they have changed, there's been no accountability for why they were.
Right.
Like with the, the change in the, anyone can hold the priesthood, any male can hold the priesthood. In the change of this revelation about LGBTQ, there's no acknowledgement of the fact that this was not okay. There was just, okay, this is how we're going to do it now.
So Mason, sounds like you really want to do a podcast on accountability.
I don't know that we can do a podcast on accountability.
Oh,
but
I
it's
can
absolutely,
make shit up. We can do it. It'll be great.
But it's absolutely an important piece of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So in closing, I want to remind our listeners that as we understand the reason, the root cause of why someone, why an organization, or why we are being dishonest, why we are not living to our full potential, what those barriers are, it's information, it's data that helps us shift and adjust so that we can live in a way that helps support our individual happiness. Thanks so much for listening today. We love you. See you next time. Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma is hosted by me, Sarah Westbrook, and my husband, Mason Westbrook. Produced by Daisy Girl Communications and Alex Vidalis. Our music today was Moving Forward by Run to Life. We are recording this morning instead of yesterday afternoon, which is probably meaningless for most of our listeners. But hey, what can you take from this? Read the room and recognize when you're in the right brain space to provide information without...
Read the room. We should talk about that. We should do a podcast on that, reading the room.
I thought we have a little bit with some of the...
I was being sarcastic.
Oh my gosh. Okay, yes. Yes, Mason, maybe we should. You brat.